Howdy, everybody. It is Thursday, the 21st of August. We're winding our class down. I'm going to post the quiz, so look for it. I've already posted the film you're supposed to watch in modules, Easy Writer, Raging Bulls. The quiz is totally based on that. You need to watch that in order to answer the 4 short, brief essay questions in the quiz, each worth 5 points apiece, 20 points. So it's important. I'll be posting that, and then besides the journal, that's it, folks. I know it's a lot for this last week. I agree, but you're gonna do your final research paper. I think that final research paper. I know there's an essay due today. This quiz, the journal, you're out. It's still hot out there. It looks like it's being hot for our foreseeable future, so they better get used to it. Where are we in the film discussion? We're coming into the 1950s, post World War II. Directors came back from the war. They couldn't make the same movies, and so the movies got a little more realistic and bleak. And this other thing came around that Hollywood couldn't figure out. That was television. Television started in the late 50s, but really got going in the 50s, where most people in the United States had a TV, black and white TV, in their house, and they were staying home and not going to the movies. They were watching television programs that were very, very popular, and they were free. Families didn't have to go out. Hollywood didn't know what to do, how to combat it, so they came up with all sorts of ideas. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, to get audiences back in the movie theater. Culturally, what was going on? We're in a Cold War with Soviet Union. Now they call it Russia, and they have nuclear capabilities, and so do we. And there's always the threat of nuclear war. Kind of still is, right? Seems like there's always a threat of that. They love throwing that around. And so that affected how we looked at entertainment and movies. Music was changing in the 50s. Elvis Presley showed up, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and rock and roll was happening. The first movie that used the rock and roll soundtrack was called Rock with Bill Haley in the comments. And you've heard that song possibly, maybe you have, on the oldie station. And we're off and running with a new youth market that was never there before. The post World War II generation, they called them the baby boomers, were growing up fast, and they were they inherited a world that was unlike their parents. There was no war. There was everybody was going to colleges. People can afford homes now. Most people had a car, maybe even 2 cars. Suburbs became popular place to go live because you no longer needed to live downtown or near your job. You could drive out to the suburbs and in your car and have a place to raise your kids that was supposedly safe and clean and wholesome. And so the television shows that depicted that, like Fathers Knows Best, the Donna Reed Show, and so many others, portrayed a portrait of America that wasn't true. It was a fiction that we wanted to believe in. We were hoping everything was like that. But if you saw television, you will see no people of color. You're not going to see any others at all. It's all white, white, white. There's no suggestion of gayness in America or anything else And so the portrayal of the American family was a very narrow one, but it was widely acceptable. Um, there was no black characters in early television. The 50s were a time of change. Art was changing in New York City. We got the famous artists like Jetson Pollock and Willem de, uh, Willem de Kooning doing their abstract expressionism. We've got people like Miles Davis and Charlie Parker and John Coltrane creating a bebop sort of jazz that nobody had ever heard before. It became cool to read. Authors coming out of the war were writing post World War II novels like Catch 22 and Slaughterhouse 5 and so many more. And the generation had a lot to say about the world we lived in. So they did. So it was a time of great creativity. Movies were struggling, but in the meantime, there was a in the meantime, there was a new form of acting in movies that was just starting to take a foothold. Started in the theater in New York City, and it was by the actors' studio, a thing called method acting. Method acting is essentially sense memory acting. The actors, instead of just performing the dialogue or saying what the dialogue said, told them to say, they had to feel what the character's going through their own sense memory. If your character is happy, you have to remember something happy and you perform it that way, something from your own life. And a lot of times, method acting was sort of like therapy. If you had sad feelings or anger, you had to dredge those feelings up. And so there was a new take on acting that we never seen before. And there was a revolution going on led by Marlon Brando. And Brando brought to the screen a naturalism that we'd never seen before. It was not fussy. It was what seemed to be more real, not so Hollywood star driven. It was more, if you watch On the Waterfront, Streetcar Named Desire, you'll see a performer performing like never seen before. Audience were shocked, and you couldn't see that on TV. So people were going to the movies to see these movies. And other actors like Montgomery Clift, James Dean, Eva St. Marie, Marilyn Monroe studied the method also with Lee Strasberg, Paul Newman. So many of our great, that generation that became huge movie stars eventually studied under Lee Strasberg and other acting coaches on the West Coast and East Coast that were teaching similar methods of realistic behavior in front of the camera. Hollywood started pushing for Technicolor films. They're trying to get the audience back into the movie theaters. They started producing huge, extravagant movies. A lot of them biblical movies like Ben Hur, Greatest Story Ever Told. The The Robe, so many more that they couldn't show on TV. And that was the catch. You had to go to the movie theater to see it. And they came up with all sorts of things like sensor around sound and hey, smell-o-vision. That's right. For a while, they thought they could get audiences back into the into the movie theater by bringing smells into the movie theater. That so if the characters are cooking on stage movie theater, if they're smelling something rotten, they smelled something rotten. Smell something good, the movie theater was supposedly going to smell what the movie was. It was a great debacle. Horror films were trying to depict the ravages and the warnings of nuclear fallout. And so there was a string of low budget horror films that had big spiders, um, crabs, that I'm not kidding. And they were hugely successful. Um, them, huge ants. Um, a great sci-fi film that came out during that time also was based on the paranoia of communism. And Day the Earth Stood Still is essentially a parable about communism taking over our world by aliens. Um, and we were believing War of the Worlds, aliens once again. The Thing is probably the most blatant warning against the spread of communism, although it's never mentioned. It's just the spread of this other information and the fact that being taken over. Great movie where the pod people take over. Um, they've remade it several times by Don Siegel. Forgetting the name of it right now, and I'll come up with it in a second. Um, it was a wonderful horror movie about a small town being invaded by space aliens, and our bodies, human bodies, are taken over by these aliens, and the aliens have no emotion. So they strip the human emotion out of who we are. And that was another warning about how communism is going to brainwash all of us and to be very wary of this new thing that's out there spreading across the world. That's how frightening of communism we were. The Senate started the hearings called the House on Un-American Activity hearings because they felt that communism was spreading through Hollywood. And they were there to try to prevent that because they didn't want propaganda films promoting communism. And so they conducted these hearings. They went on for many years. Lots and lots of careers were ruined, and lots of people had to testify, famous people. Rick Cooper, many writers, Dalton Trumbull, directors, Elie Kazan, and they would ask the witnesses if they had ever been a member of the Communist Party or do they know of anybody. And they were supposed to give names. During the 1930s in America, during the Depression, American communism seemed uh, like a pretty good deal to a lot of artists. It seemed like a fair thing. It's based on Karl Marx's teaching, not what communism turned into, not with what Stalin and the rest of them did. Uh, but this is the younger days of that, and it seemed pretty good for a young person who's struggling to find a job and to find a place in the world. Communism seemed like a pretty good deal. It's the collective; everybody's the same. There's no rich people. There's no everybody's on the same level, and it sounded pretty enticing. So a lot of young people uh, signed up once they saw what communism had turned into with the Soviet Union and then the Berlin Wall, what was going on in China, they bowed out of it. But Hollywood still wanted to know if they knew of anybody who was a communism. Now, if they didn't name people, they were held in contempt. If they named names, their careers would survive. If they didn't name people, their careers were definitely sidelined. Actors, directors, writers, their careers were over. Because they didn't name, they were unfriendly witnesses. That's how serious this was. 10 writers, Hollywood writers, ended up going to jail for a year under contempt of court for refusing to answer all the questions. They were Academy Award winning writers. There's 10 of them. Uh, they had families. Most of them were not communists, but they stood up against the witch hunt that was going on, conducted by McCarthy, who was a junior senator representative, and he was out to find communism everywhere. This is how bad it was. Elie Kazan, who had directed Marlon Brando in Streetcar Named Desire, was called in to testify. His career was just getting going. He didn't want to sacrifice it, so he named names, and some people lost their livelihood over that. Marlon Brando, who had been essentially discovered by Elie Kazan, wrote Elie Kazan a letter saying, "How dare he betray his fellow people, his actors," and he never want to speak or work with him again. A year after that letter, Elie Kazan had a film script called On the Waterfront. He wanted Marlon Brando to play the part, so he sent Brando the script. Brando read the script and changed his mind, worked with him again and again in Viva Zapata, and Brando won the Academy Award for On the Waterfront for Best Actor. So even Brando's strict stance on his friend's betrayal, he had to take it back because the movie was that good and he wanted to be a part of it. So these are trying times for performers and actors in film in Hollywood. We come out of the decade, and in France, there's a new movement they called it the French New Wave, uh, led by Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard, and they made and others with their films 400 Blows and Breathless. They were low budget films filmed in a new way because they don't have the money that Hollywood does and those studios. And they filmed on the streets in Paris in a more naturalistic way, and it changed again. A paradigm changed. The film students who were starting to go to film school that became famous later on in the 60s and the 70s, people like Francis Ford Coppola, who directed The Godfathers, George Lucas, who did Star Wars, Steven Spielberg, you know who that is, right? Jaws and the rest of it, looked at these films as a game changer. They saw what France was doing, they wanted to be part of it. And so the 60s started with this optimism of these new film people trying to get power in Hollywood. They had none at the time. The old studio chiefs are still controlling everything, and they didn't know what to do. They were making these kind of stories that really were losing the audience, which was the youth audience. The older people were staying home and watching TV, and the youth were staying away from the movies because they couldn't relate to anything. They were seeing like big extravagant musicals and like Hello Dolly and other musicals. They go, we're the films that we can relate to. Now, if you watch that documentary, that's in there. That's what the documentary is all about. These new directors, they call them auteurs, which is a French word for author. They were the author of their own work, not because studio heads weren't the authors. These directors were the authors, meaning they brought a personal stamp to the film visually and with the characters, and it was a new generation. The older generation didn't understand it. They were still trying to do what they always did, and they had lost the youth market, which was huge at this time. Throughout the United States, there was drive-in movie theaters, which was huge for kids going to the drive-ins in their car. At one time, there's 5,000 or so drive-ins, and so this youthful directors saw this market being nobody was paying attention to it. Somebody by the name of Roger Corman came along, a producer who's still alive, by the way, and he saw a marketplace for youth, and so he started making low budget horror films. Um, Most of them, a lot of them based on Edgar Allan Poe, uh, and motorcycle films, biker films. Hell's Angels was a big phenomenon at this point in time. And so he started making these biker films and these horror films for the drive in market. And the kids loved this stuff. They went to these movies in droves. Hollywood still couldn't figure out the youth market. Rock and roll was hitting big time. The Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, and the game was no longer being played like it used to be. The youth were the majority of the population. They were going to college. It was the most educated class of generation of people in the history of our country. And during this time, we had social upheaval, and this is in the documentary. You need to pay attention to it. Social upheaval with the civil rights movement. Blacks still didn't have a fair shake, and the Vietnam War was raging, a very unpopular war. And there was a thing called the draft. Men of 18 to 25 could be drafted into the military and shipped off to Vietnam. There was protests on campus, civil unrest. That was going on along with assassinations. We lost John Kennedy in 1963. We lost his brother Bobby in 68. We lost Martin Luther King in 68. We lost Malcolm X the year before. These were Black leaders of the civil rights movement. Assassinations had ripped a hole in the soul of this country, and the youth were out protesting. They were pissed off, and they're also upset that there was nothing they could see on the big screen that represented them. Until a trio of films started. This is all in the documentary, folks. You need to watch it. A trio of films starting with essentially Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate. Midnight Cowboy. These films were a revolution. They were aimed at a youth market, and they went to these movies and they made tons of money. Easy Rider was a biker film about two drug dealers essentially make a drug score and go to Mardi Gras, New Orleans, and they go on their bikes. These great bikes they had. Starred Peter Fonda, and he produced it also. Dennis Hopper, who acted in it and was directed it, and it made a star of Jack Nicholson, who had a great part in it as the lawyer who goes with them on this search for America. But tragedy befalls them because they're considered hippies and alternative people. They are in the deep south and they are murdered. But it had a rock and roll soundtrack of popular hits of the day. And this $300,000 movie made hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a phenomenon. It went to the Cannes Film Festival. This is also all in the documentary. People hadn't seen anything like it, and Hollywood perks up when the money's being made like that. And they thought, let's make movies with these people. And so the door was wide open for filmmakers like Martin Scorsese, Francis Coppola, Hal Ashby to come in the door and make what they felt were relevant films um, for this new generation of rock and rollers who were educated. Pardon me. So movies like Badlands and Mean Streets, Robert Altman's MASH and McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Hal Ashby's Harold and Maude and Shampoo, Terrence Malick's Badlands changed the face of cinema, and they made money. And for a brief time in Hollywood, these auteur directors, and this is in the documentary, controlled, had power to get movies made. And the old studio heads had to listen because they had lost touch, and these new directors felt like they were in touch and made some of probably 50, 60 the best movies Hollywood ever made. They called it the last golden age of Hollywood. There had been another one. Remember, I told you about 1939? That was definitely a golden age. Um, this was supposedly the last one, and that's what the documentary is about. Um, the auteur director was bringing in the stories, and mostly the story franchised youth or younger people know their place in the world that was full of civil unrest, the Vietnam War, and women's movement. Women were trying to finally get fair play. They still haven't got it yet, folks. But they're trying. And so across the board, there was unrest. In the meantime, presented, and so some black directors and writers and actors started making their own films, and they labeled them black exploitation films, and they were aimed at a black audience in inner cities like Chicago, New York, and South Central LA. Well, guess who showed up at the movie theaters? White people. They came to the movies too, especially students. They dug them. Movies like Shaft and Superfly and Coffee Brown. These were black characters were the hero of the movie, and that never been seen before. Then we have another movement within a movement. Hollywood essentially came calling. They saw the money was being made, so they started making their own version of black exploitations with white directors, and of course, it failed, and that was it. It was a brief scene. Now, the movie doesn't cover much of this at all, um, because it's about these other directors, white men, no women, folks. We're getting a chance to direct yet. That was coming later. So now that we're this is a really thumbnail sketch of Hollywood movies because I could spend weeks on each of these movements, but we can't. We got to move on. So now we're going through this. We've gone through the 50s, the 60s. Now we're well into the 70s. We're going to come out into the 80s. What was the downfall? The auteur director was, and this is in the test, folks. If you're listening to my lecture, I'm giving you answers. Um, a film called Jaws by Steven Spielberg came out in 1975, and it was so popular, based on a bestseller novel about a great white shark, feeding off people at the beach. It hit the zeitgeist of fear of going to the beach and swimming, and the pop culture and the youth culture. It hit, and it was the first movie to ever make $100 million, and it was the story was about how much money it made for the first time. We never knew what movies made. That was just a private accounting thing. Um, Now the story was the money, and it changed everything. The studios started looking at how to make those kind of films. 2 years later, Star Wars with George Lucas comes out, and that essentially nailed the coffin shut on the meaningful auteur directors' films. Yes, folks, I say meaningful because movies like Jaws and Star Wars are B movies, entertainment movies, melodramas. Star Wars, folks, is essentially a Western set in outer space with little cute robots and evil doers who wear black, by the way, and the good guys are in white. And it was a gigantic phenomenon. And the documentary was kind of going to end on that. And so the studios saw that they could make those kind of films. They knew how to do that. High budgeted B movies, they called them, with these simple stories. And that ended the era of these auteur directors who didn't make that sort of film. The last movie that was made by Martin Scorsese kind of closes the decade out. It was called Raging Bull with Robert De Niro, and that was essentially it. The 80s, we're going to jet stream into sequels, endless sequels. Look at your documentary. I'm giving you the answers now. What inspired the auteur directors was what was going on in the culture, was the civil unrest and an upheaval, the Vietnam War. The French New Wave had a huge influence on them. When they got into Hollywood, they influenced the audience. The audience saw things they could relate to, not just smoking pot and having sex, but also the characters being conflicted about their place in the world. And the influence was on. These directors were influencing, they influenced me. That's never stopped. I wanted to become a director after I saw these movies. Um, that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to make those kind of films. I still do. I still believe in it. And that the influence those directors had on my generation is as undeniable as a philosophy, as a way of thinking, as a way of operating in the world. Everything changed in the 1980s with movies like Goonies, Gremlins, and Top Gun. And I know you love Top Gun, but it's a fairy tale. And we'll get into that later as I continue our journey to the present. Look for the test. If you listen to this, I gave all the answers away. See you next time. Stay cool.